So, as Rick said, I'm Darin Lynch, and I hope I have half as much fun talking today as I did at Rick's cabin last summer, and I do hope I censor myself a little bit more. So I won't subject you to any lame jokes to get things going. I'm a fun hater. You can tell by looking at me that I'm a fun hater. So what I'm going to talk about today is business first, online second. We've had a lot of great speakers come through here over the last few years that I've been coming to Club E. Betsy's talked about how to present and sales and marketing, and other people have talked about client appreciation, how to take good care of employees. We've had entrepreneurial people speak, venture capitalists, etc. What I'm going to talk about is kind of the online space, which is really confusing to a lot of people. And I would argue that there's nobody in here, whether you're a solopreneur or a big company, that doesn't need to know how it works and how to have a good online presence. So that's what we're going to cover today. As Rick mentioned, we use a phrase at Irish Titan we've trademarked called business first, online second. So that's how I'm framing this. But a couple of housekeeping items. This is not a commercial for Irish Titan. Most of you already have the misfortune of knowing, or some of you anyway, have the misfortune of knowing me. Some of you are sitting closely. If you throw anything, make sure it won't stain. But this is more about just the online space. And I'll use some sayings and some philosophies that we use, but this is for all of you to leave here, hopefully learn something. I want to make good use of everyone's time, go back to your desks and apply some value. Okay? So that's one housekeeping item. Secondly, I will try to edit myself. Every once in a while I swear. I grew up on a farm in Iowa. My dad's kind of legendary for how much he can swear, so I apologize in advance for anything that might slip out. Okay. So the agenda. There are 4 things that we'll work through, and I'll try to be respectful of time, so we'll work through these as quickly as we can. We're going to talk about the industry, what it is about the industry that makes this notion of business first, online second a reasonable notion. We'll talk about the process, how you build a website, how you build your online presence. We'll talk about some questions that you could ask of potential partners to get a sense of whether they're the right fit, and then we'll provide an example, okay? One thing I'll ask, too, is raise your hand, ask questions, interrupt me as we go through this. As I mentioned, I want to make sure we make really good use of people's time. We'll end at 1 o'clock, and so if the group as a whole starts to ask some questions and take us off the rails on the presentation, that's totally fine. So feel free to interrupt and ask questions that matter to you, okay? Lastly, and you'll see on that top left corner, it says 1/industry or parentheses. For those of you with short attention spans or that get restless easy, you can track our progress by looking at that, okay? So if you're like me, you start to get a little antsy, so you'll be able to see how far along we are by looking at that. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is the industry. What is it about the industry that makes business first, online second a reasonable phrase? The first thing that comes to mind, and I've been talking about this for a long time now, is our industry is the Wild West. There are some people in here that I work with that are part of our industry, and it changes constantly. There are no barriers to entry. One of the sayings I have is you can't swing a dead cat without hitting somebody that builds a website. And that's because there's no capital costs. All you need is a laptop and wireless. And it doesn't even need to be your wireless. So someone working on a laptop at Panera can be a web company, okay? So that's great for creativity. You get a lot of people coming into the space with ideas. There's change constantly. The development and design principles are always improving. But that also gives rise to a lot of acronyms, a lot of people coming in who might not have good business sense. They might start a business today, get a couple of clients, and then decide 3 months from now that, oh, this isn't what I signed up for, and then they bail. And so there's a Wild West mentality to this online space, which creates a lot of confusion for the clients, okay? Second thing, out of these 2 circumstances that I think give rise to business first, online second, is this sense of voodoo. And what I mean by that is the online space sits at the intersection of 2 disciplines that aren't very well understood and can't really be very easily explained. And that's design/creative and technology. Both of those disciplines are disciplines that people don't understand very easily if they're not in them, and then people who are in them oftentimes don't explain them very well. Sometimes intentionally, to keep distance, and sometimes because it's difficult to articulate. there are a lot of acronyms and a lot of industry jargon and buzz terms and those sorts of things. And so it's often viewed as something that, the online space, as something that people don't easily understand. So you combine that with that Wild West mentality, and there's just a lot of unrest and hesitation on knowing how to move forward and who to work with and how to do it. So those are two circumstances that combined with this principle make the industry difficult to navigate. And this principle is that your online presence needs to be a well-oiled machine. It's not just your website, and it's not just SEO, and it's not just anything else that someone comes along and tries to sell you. It needs to all work together. No component can work in isolation, but to add to that, you don't have to spend $1 million on all of them. So you only have a certain amount of budget, everyone in here. I only have a certain amount of budget. Every one of you only has a certain amount of budget that we can spend on our business. So what that means is, in the online space, you need to figure out how you're going to allocate time and energy and budget to your website, how you're going to allocate time and energy and budget to content, SEO, pay-per-click. These are just this is just a sampling of the different disciplines within that online tent. So hosting, how much are you going to spend on hosting? How much are you going to spend on SEO? And by how much, that's time and energy, not just budget. So you have that Wild West environment. You have that sense of voodoo with two disciplines that aren't easily articulated and aren't easily understood, but you have to get it all working together. And so when I was on the other side of the table, the last job I had before starting Irish Titan was when I was CIO at Second Swing Golf. And I always joke because I'm a shitty golfer. And I mean that. I'm not like a 4 handicap trying to get to a 2. I'm probably a triple-digit handicap. But it was still great because I like sports a lot. But when I was on that side of the table, I was really frustrated because people would come in and try to sell me online services that either I didn't need, and if they would have any business sense, they would have known I didn't need, or they didn't talk to me in a business sense. And so that's where I started to develop this notion of business first, online second, because I had seen that Wild West and the voodoo, and I was trying to figure out how to leverage this for actual business purposes. Okay? So that's kind of the industry background. Is that all making sense? Is everyone tracking? Yeah. Perfect. Actually, I was going to ask that later. Yeah, correct. I should slap myself. So SEO stands for search engine optimization. And what that means is organic traffic is another way to refer to that. What that means is your site is attracting traffic for what your business is. A good analogy for this is if you open a restaurant, you can attract business through word of mouth, or you can attract business through some ads, be it on Yelp or a billboard or in the Sunday circulars. Doing the ads, Yelp, billboard, Sunday circular, that's like pay-per-click or PPC or SEM, search engine marketing. Attracting business to your restaurant through word of mouth is like SEO, search engine optimization. So that's what SEO means. Does that make sense? Great. We're already going off the rails. I love it.
It seems like a natural progression. Could you give just a little bit on what makes good SEO? Without selling the secret sauce.
Yeah, right. One thing I was going to mention at the beginning of my presentation, kind of during the housekeeping section, was we're not, and I'm not, an expert in every discipline within the online space. And that's because it changes so fast, it's so broad. There are other people in here that I said, like our peers of ours, that have areas of expertise. So I wouldn't say that we're an SEO, that I'm an SEO expert, but the way SEO works is always changing. There's a reason Google makes $1 gazillion, and they don't always share, well, they never share their secret sauce. They do share insights and best practices, but SEO has really evolved over the last few years to being basically the way I would describe it is more content driven. So there are certain best practices to take when you build your site from a technical perspective. Setting those aside, because everyone would fall asleep if I went through those, if you focus on building a good site with good content that is readable to an actual human and not just a search index engine, that's the best place to start from an SEO perspective. After that, it becomes a content strategy, off-page content strategy, pay-per-click can start to filter into that, etc. So SEO is a common place where things are sold, snake oil is sold. It's kind of like social media. I also feel social media is a place where people in our space sell a bill of goods, and there is not a lot of substance to it because it changes constantly. It's jargon and acronym riddled, and it's difficult to define, and quite honestly, it's difficult to commit to and then measure results because online and offline activities all contribute to that. So a firm like ours could structure the site correctly, develop a good content strategy, work with you on that, and that could have a great result. You could be doing offline, speaking like I'm doing right now, or going to trade shows. That could start to drive traffic. And so it's difficult. It's like marketing in general that is difficult to measure. So SEO is similar to that. Any other questions? Okay, so the next section of the conversation, this dialogue, is the process, how you build your site. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different disciplines underneath this online tent. SEO that we've talked about a little bit, content, pay-per-click, etc. On this section, I'm going to focus on how to build your website, okay? Now, that's not that your website's the end-all be-all because remember, it has to be a well-oiled machine. But generally, you really can't and shouldn't do the others unless you have at least a website, okay? Now, the website process is often super frustrating for clients. We hear that all the time when we talk to prospects. They'll say, well, God, it was just a pain in the ass to get this site built. It took forever, budget went over, etc. So one of the things I want to do here is demystify some of that process. And I'm not going to show you code, but we'll just talk through some of the steps. The first place to start, quite honestly, is knowing who you are. Nobody in our space can build you a good website unless you know who you are. Sometimes clients know who they are but can't articulate it. Sometimes clients don't know who they are. As long as they know that they don't know who they are, that's okay. It's a problem if they think they know who they are but they don't. That's a separate conversation. But we have to start there. And we have some steps we go through. Other firms in our space have steps they go through. And the process that we follow, anybody that knows me knows I'm a big fan of this start with why concept. It's from a book by an author named Simon Sinek. The book is called Start with Why. And his argument is that most companies talk about what they do. Some can talk about how they do it, but hardly anybody knows or can talk about why they do it. And the argument with Start with Why is that you would start with why. Turn that inside out because it's more important to know why you're in business. Next most important is to know how you do your business. And ironically, the least important thing to know is what you do because that can evolve over time. I have a whole different speech that I give over Start with Why, but this is the mental framework we use to get our clients to understand or articulate who they are. Because once we know who they are, then we can start to build an online presence that supports their business model. Because your online presence should not be a standalone effort that once you're done, you put it on the shelf and it operates on its own. That's just not the way it works. With the way technology works today, this should be an integrated part of your business. It should be just part of your business and supporting all the different initiatives and reflecting your business as it grows. So the first thing to do is know who you are and start with why is the model that we use. Secondly, requirements. Both knowing who you are and defining requirements are two steps that everyone wants to skip over because they want to get to the pictures. They want to see what their site's going to look like. And that is a recipe for disaster because in a website project, there are two kinds of people. Everyone thinks they're an art critic and everyone thinks they're a copywriter. And so if you get to those steps first, then the whole thing bogs down because you overlook what you're actually trying to accomplish with your website and how your website is going to support your business. So you need to define your requirements. When people come to your site, what should they do? So for example, with the Club E site, one of the things that Rick would want is event sign up. So when people come to the Club E site, they should be able to sign up for events. Maybe email sign up would be another functionality, another requirement. CRM integration, if you use Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics or something like that. That might be a requirement that when people come to your site and download case studies or white papers, which might be a requirement, you want them automatically populating into your CRM system. Those are just examples of the requirements that you need to define. And those should be captured somewhere, not just in a conversation. So they should go into a spreadsheet, a Word document, using a tool maybe called Basecamp. We use that. It's a real common tool. Somewhere that should be documented so that you can check back against that and make sure your requirements are being met. Okay? One of the outcomes of this requirements phase, some of the deliverables, are things like site maps and wireframes. Does anybody know what a site map is? I know you do. Don't raise your hand, Kevin. Okay, so at least some people do. That's like a flow chart of your site, as maybe a home page, and then about us and services, things like that. It's just a flow chart. And then wireframes are blueprints of a page. So there's no design. There aren't, it usually doesn't even really have copy, has lorem ipsum. But it lays out your page so that you can make sure you're covering your requirements. It might show where the sign up for newsletter button is, etc. And by removing the design from the wireframes in that requirements phase, that helps make sure that you're building a site, that you're getting a site that's going to support your business requirements. Okay? And I have sitemaps and wireframes I could show people if they want to see it. Okay, so now, let me double check. So now you know who you are, you've defined your requirements, so now you start to build it. And this is what everybody wants to skip to, as I mentioned. But if you have those first two steps taken care of, this process, this step of the project, goes much more smoothly. Budget has a lot higher degree of success, and it's a better experience. So this is where design, this is where development, this is where QA, or testing, which is often overlooked, happens. And so once you get to this phase of the project, if everything else has been done right, this can go smoothly. Doesn't mean that there won't be some problems. One of the things we talk about with our clients is that at the beginning of the project, everyone's happy, it's kind of the honeymoon period. We hope we're still friends at the end because there are always speed bumps. There's some technology that doesn't work right if you're integrating. Design turns into a mess because there are too many chefs in the kitchen that want to have an input on design. Something like that's going to happen. But if you take care of knowing who you are and the requirements, this part of the process goes relatively well. Now, up until now, you've probably had, hopefully, kind of a high-touch experience where you've been getting regular updates, you're feeling that your partner's communicating with you, you're seeing designs, and all excited, and that's great. Then when the development starts, a lot of clients start to feel let down, like, ugh, what happened? Because the development phase, when they're actually programming, is a little bit like an iceberg, where there's way more happening under the surface than what you see. And it doesn't make sense to see it halfway. You can't jump halfway across the ditch, just like you can't look at a site that's half done. So there's an element of disappointment sometimes during the development phase because it feels quiet. So what you want to do is make sure that you have trust in that partner and seeing some status updates, but then have a little bit of patience because then it all comes up at once where then you can start to test it. And then testing is an important phase. If you think you're going to build a site, let me back up. If you think you're going to hire someone to build a site for you, and then they'll go away, and 2 weeks later or 3 months later or whatever, come back and say, here you go, that's not the way it's going to work. That site's yours. You need to own that. And so a good partner is going to own walking you through that process and building a good site for you to look at, but then you need to be active and spend time testing your site. Now, based on the complexity of your site and the size of your organization, that can take longer or shorter, but you need to be an active participant in making sure that site, the copy looks right, the design looks right, that site's meeting your needs. So you need to reserve some time in that, what we call QA. Okay? So after your site's built, you still have to nurture it. And this is where SEO, pay-per-click, content marketing, affiliate marketing, things like this, which all could support a whole different lunch conversation. That's where these come into play. The main thing that I want to convey here is you can't have this mindset of build it and they will come. That used to happen all the time in our industry. I think with the emergence of SEO and social marketing, things like that, I think that's kind of gone by the wayside. Most people know that you're generally out there adding content and posting updates, things along that nature, or things of that nature. But you still have to nurture it to some degree after you launch your site. That needs to be part of your plan. Even if it's minimal, you need to be aware of it. Okay? So that's how sites get built. Does that make sense? Any questions? Eric?
If that's your family's farm for real, you have a farm, what platform would you take it, put that budget into?
For a website platform?
Website or e-commerce combined platform?
Well, so that's actually a good question that I speak to part of it a little bit later, because one of the questions you should ask of a potential partner is what their mindset is around proprietary software versus what's called open source software, okay? Proprietary software has license fees that you have to pay to continue to use. Open source software generally doesn't. That's kind of a business conversational way to describe it. We are in the open source space. So we use tools like Drupal for what we call complicated websites that have CRM or back office client portal sort of integration. And we use a platform called Magento for e-commerce. Other platforms that people might hear about would be WordPress. That's really common. There are a lot of sites built in WordPress. There are a lot of sites built in Joomla. There are all these funky names. Expression Engine is another one. .NET Nuke is a Microsoft version. And then there are proprietary platforms like Sitecore is a big proprietary platform. So those are some of the platform names that you might hear bandied about while you're talking to people. Okay? So now that there's some understanding of why the industry is a little crazy with the Wild West Voodoo kind of stuff, and now that you have some flyover understanding of how your website should be built, how that process should go, the next thing that I thought would be helpful for everybody to know are questions you should ask potential partners to see if you're getting a fit. Everyone here places different priorities on different things. So these questions are open-ended and just kind of a sampling of things that will help you get a feel for whether that potential partner is the right fit for you. Okay? So the first thing that you want to start to discover about that partner is how they actually think. Because the way that they think about the online space needs to fit with what you're looking for. So again, I do all of this within a business first, online second kind of framework. So one of the things that I talk about with people is how to view your website as either part of your balance sheet or your income statement. If you're an e-commerce company, you better be viewing that as part of your income statement because it's supposed to be driving actual revenue. Otherwise, you're not a very good e-commerce company. If you're not in e-commerce, then it could be maybe balance sheet, maybe income statement, kind of depends. But it's a kind of conversation that not a lot of technical design, web kind of people can engage in very naturally because they don't think like that. But not none of you, most of you aren't in that space. You're not the providers of that, you're the consumers of that, the clients. So it is your business. So that website, that online presence needs to support your business, and you want somebody that gets that. Whether or not they think income statement or balance sheet, you want someone that gets that and thinks like that. So that would be a question, is it should be on income statement or balance sheet. How do they engage with you? Do they have a single point of contact? Do they have a team-based approach? What do they do when the project's done? These are all questions that can be indicative of how they think about their business. Another great question. A lot of people a few years ago wanted apps. 7, 8 years ago, it was social marketing that blew up. Everybody wanted it, even if they had no idea why. They wanted it. A few years ago, apps blew up. Everybody wanted an app. There are tons of reasons apps don't make sense for most people. How are you going to find it in the App Store? How are you going to maintain, are you going to do an Android app and an iOS app? How are you going to maintain different code bases, et cetera? All of which might still mean you should do an app, but those are questions that can be asked to make sure you're not being led down a path that doesn't make sense. And with current technologies, there are web-based apps that make sense to do it via your website instead of in an iOS or Android platform. So ask them that. That's a good question to see what how they think about their business and the industry. Second question, how are they built? And this really varies because our industry isn't regulated, the Wild West aspect. There are companies who use freelancers. There are companies who do offshore work. There are companies that use just employees. None of those options is inherently better than any of the others. What you want to know is that they have a cohesive, well thought out business model. At Irish Titan, we do all of our work with our employees. So everything's done with people in our office. And I do that because our business is built around this notion of business first, online second, and then partnerships, not transactions, blah, blah, blah. But the point is, I need people that kind of drink that Kool-Aid, for lack of a better phrase, and are part of the team. Other companies build their companies differently, which is fine. But each one of those resource models, you might want to ask them some questions. So for us, just to be transparent, you might want to ask us, how do you handle scalability? Because if you're doing everything with employees and you close 2 deals today, how are you going to get those onboarded tomorrow? That'd be a question you'd want to ask somebody that has an employee-based model. If it's someone who's using freelancers, you might want to ask them, how do they do quality control? How do they manage that their process is the same every time? If it's offshore resources, how do they manage those? How do they manage any language and time zone challenges or differences? All of which are fine. You just want to see that they have an answer, and a well thought out answer, because that's indicative that they know how they were built and they were intentional about it. Another question, how long have they been in business? Because companies can come and go. Are they virtual? Those are all questions that give you a sense, the answers to those questions give you a sense of how they've built their business. Lastly, how do they deliver? This is more tactical and mechanical. What tools are they using to actually develop and deliver your website? What process do they use? How do they test? How do they involve you in testing? What about hosting? Do they host themselves? Do they use a hosting company? How do they involve you in the QA process? This is the stuff that starts to get in the weeds on the project, but it's questions that someone should be asking to make sure there's some consistency and quality in how they deliver, okay? Generally, my philosophy is if you line up on those first 2 questions, how do they think and how are they built, then this question usually will work itself out. Maybe it's that whole start with why concept that they have a lot of their things figured out, so the mechanics naturally fall in place. So start with those other 2, those first 2 questions, but then you should explore this some too. Okay? So is that helpful in some questions and some thought process that everyone can leverage in looking at partners? Wendy?
Darin, you've been fantastically helpful to us in beginning to build genuine growth. Do you find that you do more business consulting than actually the online aspect of it personally? And do you like that balance between guys and business?
Well, as far as our line items on our P&L would say, we don't do any business consulting because we go to market as helping people build their online presence. But the process that we use to do that involves a lot of business consulting. We have this process. It's the process we use. Doesn't mean it's the right one for everybody, but it's the process that we use. And so we have discovery, we have elaboration. You know, the rest you can read for yourself. Those 2 phases. Pardon me? Oh, correct. Good idea. So we have 6 phases in our process. We have kickoff, discovery, elaboration, construction, QA, and closeout. Just double checking. And so particularly discovery and elaboration are business consulting heavy, if you will. Especially if someone doesn't know who they are, back to that question, because that's where we ferret that out. help them articulate that, bring that to life with the design and with the content and the information architecture. So those two phases are very business focused. And we get those out of the way because then when we start construction, it's all defined. So we don't go to market as a business consulting company, but we do that within the realms of our process. Yeah?
I have a question about pricing. Do you start out with this is what it costs, or do you change that when you get to discovery?
All these questions were great because I had notes on almost every one of these and I've skipped over some of those notes. One of the questions I had in asking them how they think is how they price, because our space is riddled with budget overruns. And sometimes clients in our space price hourly. And they say, we think it's going to cost $20,000, $50,000, whatever the number might be, but we're just going to bill you hourly. That's okay if they want to do that and you're okay with that. Some people do a fixed bid. It's going to cost $25,000. Some people do project ranges. We do project ranges. So we might say we think it's going to cost $25,000 to $32,000. And then at the end of discovery, we do a budget check. And at the end of elaboration, we do another budget check. And so we think of it like a funnel. As you're going down that funnel, it should get more and more precise and more defined and confirmed. So that's the way we do it. Doesn't mean it's better. That's just the way we do it. Part of it depends on the complexity of your online needs. The more complex it is, the more, quite honestly, it should be something like a range or some flexibility, because if it's a $100,000 project and you're going to hold a company like us to a fixed bid, a project of that size has so many things to figure out that we would want to price it at $150,000 to protect ourselves. And I'm kind of making up numbers, but that's something to ask them is how they price that. And then if they have budget checks and steps like that in their process. So in our process, every step along here has multiple client approvals that are documented. We use a tool called EchoSign. It's an electronic approval system so that clients always know that where we are on the budget, on schedule, that requirements are in check, that we're adding something, etc. So lots of budget checks and lots of status updates and approvals are helpful when you're thinking about the money. Yes, sir.
Turn on your over-the-horizon radar and tell us what you think might be out there on a 5-year look in terms of where the technology is going to be, where the market is going to be, and how does that apply on a global basis?
So that's a great question. 5 years is forever in the technology space. So in some respect, I have no idea what some of the technology will look like. What I think will happen are a couple of things. It's already been happening where we're becoming device independent. So everyone, not everyone, but probably a great majority of people in this room have a smartphone. Probably a majority of people in this room have a tablet. And so one of the things that's happened over the last couple of years is a principle called responsive design, where instead of building a mobile site and a website, with the mobile site being a separate code base that runs on your smartphone, there's a responsive design principle where you build one site that works on every device. That's going to become more and more prominent. I would argue, no matter how small your site is, anybody in this room that's starting a website project right now should do responsive design. Unless you're a restaurant, then there's different reasons, but that's a different story. So responsive design and those devices will become more and more common. We've already ourselves had more and more clients with translation needs, wanting their sites to translate automatically to other languages. There's a lot of emerging technology to make that much easier because Google Translate works kind of, but not really that great all the time. And so things like that will happen more and more. One prediction I have that I think some people, guys and girls I'm friends with who own some of these companies would disagree with me. I think apps are going to go by the wayside. They're too difficult to manage. They're too difficult to find in the store. It's separate code bases. I think apps as we know them today will go by the wayside because web-based apps, the technologies for those are becoming more and more easy to use, and cost effective. So people will build a web-based app that will work on every device because internet's becoming more ubiquitous. So that's one thing that I'll say, and I've argued with some people over beers usually, that apps are going to go away. Yeah?
If you use responsive design, how long should you expect this to last before people are arguing that you've got to scrap it and start over?
If you've already built a site in responsive,
Yeah.
then if your site's already in responsive, the only reason you would need to rebuild your site is if your business changes and your site doesn't reflect your business accurately anymore. Because if it was built the right way, then it shouldn't be necessary to change because of responsive design. Now, generally a question, if I understood the question, but a question a lot of people, there are a couple of questions a lot of people ask. How long should my site last before I have to rebuild it in general? And the question, or excuse me, the answer to that is if you build it with what's called a CMS or a content management system, that should help you hold that site longer because that allows, first of all, that's another thing I say. Nobody in this room go build a site that doesn't have a content management system, okay? Make sure you do that. Because then a non-technical person at your company can log in to your website /admin, usually, and make content changes, upload images, etc. So you don't need a developer or a designer or anybody of a technical nature to be doing that. We don't want you calling us to update your address. When I started Irish Titan, from the very beginning, we did a content management system with every website we ever did. And if I would have made a bigger deal about that 10 years ago, I'd live in a lot bigger house right now because that was really rare. Now it's really common. The reason I did that is because when I was at Second Swing, we moved from Minnetonka up to Plymouth, and I had to call our e-commerce provider to update the address on our website. And quite honestly, that pissed me off. It was a pain in the ass. I didn't want to have to do that. And so we've done a content management system in every site since then. And clients today should really expect that so that you can make changes on your own. So if you have a content management system and your site's built in a way that reflects your business, then that site should last you 3-4 years, maybe 5. So that's how long a site should last that has been well built and reflects your business if you know who you were, define requirements well, etc. Does that help a little bit? Any other questions? How are we doing on time?
Kind of bumping up on time, but a couple things. One, if there's one more question, let's do that. But we also have the room as long as anyone wants to stay. So as long as you can stay, as long as anyone wants to ask questions, we can stay here. But why don't we have one more question before the kind of 1 o'clock witching hour? Anybody has?
George.
Darin and Irish Titan are building the website for FBI. It's a group of potential executives that I will. You folks do a great job. We appreciate your work. How do you approach nonprofits like us versus for-profit organizations on that business first, online second kind of question? How do you see that different?
We actually don't view that very differently because a nonprofit is still a business, maybe with a more socially conscious purpose.
Or different tax status.
Yeah, right, different tax status. So we don't view that very differently. We approach it differently, quite honestly, with how we book it. We have a program, we really haven't publicized this yet. We've had a decent year and had some PR, and we get out there a lot, so we're kind of saving this for when things are quiet. But we do a quarterly program where we build one nonprofit for free every quarter. It's kind of our way to give back, and we're using our employees to get more involved in that and help select the nonprofits, et cetera. So we view it differently, kind of corporate social responsibility, but every nonprofit still goes through that process because they have to. Otherwise, the website doesn't reflect them, and it doesn't have the right functionality because a nonprofit might still want e-commerce, might still want event sign up, et cetera. And so we need to go through that same process regardless of the business. And that's a good segue. We get asked a lot what industry we specialize in. We don't specialize in any industry. And I've been intentional about that because with this process and a business first, online second kind of mentality, we can apply that across different industries. Now, some companies want a partner who specializes in their industry, and that might be valid. It's just we've taken a different approach.
What's the selection process for
I don't quite have that defined very well yet. So we don't have that defined very well yet, right?
We have it's just not like on a nice piece of paper.
Yeah, so we should talk maybe afterwards. The question was what criteria we use to select the nonprofits we work with. And that's what we don't have defined very well.
Okay, so we have the room as long as anyone wants to stay. Thank you, Darin.
Thanks, everybody.